Hey, it's Friday. Let's have a cocktail with Anna Glowinski.
Queer or straight, young or old, there is no denying that James Dean was a good-looking guy. He's extremely, extremely handsome, taken way too early, to be fair. I feel like there could have been so much more to be seen from him. Although perhaps it might have been a shame just to see how he aged. It's like he just passed away and left us with an almost perfect image. But that image actually helped to shape how Americans in the Western society viewed masculinity. And also the question around straightness and queerness and holding a position of popularity, in places like Hollywood. I'm joined by Jason Colavito now. He's written a book, Jimmy, The Secret Life of James Dean. And he's going to tell us, hopefully, all about him, all about this character. Jason, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. I see that you've got a couple of copies of the book in the background. When did you release the book?
The book came out in November in the United States, and it is being released on Sunday in the United Kingdom.
Oh, this is very exciting. Very exciting. Has it got pictures in it? Is it a picture book?
Well, not quite a picture book, but yes, it does indeed have pictures in it.
Because you talk a lot about James, or Jimmy, should we say, his image. So I feel like perhaps a book about him couldn't go without having a few images in there. Why have you called the book Jimmy for a start? It's a very casual name for this iconic figure.
Well, certainly. There have been a lot of biographies of James Dean over the years, and about 9 out of 10 of them are named James Dean. So I wanted to make mine a little bit different. So I chose to call it after the name he used for himself. James Dean always called himself Jimmy. He didn't care for formality. So I thought that to differentiate my book and to show that I'm really looking at the private person behind the public image, I would use the name that he used with his friends and family.
Well, exactly, because you talk about, the secret person. That's, a bit of a mystery, I suppose, behind the images. For a start, why did you want to focus on that side of his personality?
Well, one of the things I was trying to do in this book is to look beyond the public face and beyond the iconic movie image. In the book, I call it almost a celluloid saint, the kind of iconic Hollywood image that was made out of James Dean, to really look at the person that he was underneath that and the person that turned into this after he died. Because in life, he wasn't the person that we think of from the photographs and from the movies. He was a very different person behind the scenes. And what I really wanted to do was to get into the makeup of what turns a person from a real flesh and blood human into this kind of mythic character.
Yeah, and like you say, he has transcended generations with his character, with that personalization of him that sort of fed out to the masses. But I've actually bowled in here, assuming that everybody knows perhaps more about him than they do. So could you just give us a little bit of a background about him, not the secret life, the stuff that is more out there, the films that he was in, what he's known for?
Sure. James Dean was an actor in the 1950s. He died very young at the age of 24 in a car accident, and he left behind him 3 iconic movies that many people will recognize instantly: East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant. And in these movies, he tended to play a sort of disaffected teenage character. He became sort of the almost prototype of what the American teenager would be. And James Dean, because of the way he looked and the way he dressed and the way he acted, became the sort of model for modern young masculinity that has lasted from the 1950s straight through today. Many actors, many musicians have all cited him as their inspiration. And there's hardly a man alive today who hasn't in some way been influenced by James Dean.
Well, that's a bold statement. In what way would you say influenced by him, a man alive today? Consciously?
Sure. Well, it's not exactly as though every person on the face of the earth is familiar with James Dean and is copying him, but he set the standard for how people dress, how they talk, how they comb their hair. And whether you're doing it directly in imitation or down the line of telephone from one generation to the next, every time you put on a t-shirt, every time you comb your hair a certain way, every time you talk in that sort of masculine grumble that's popular with all of the actors, that's all comes directly out of the templates that James Dean set in the 1950s.
And how did he change what was sort of a different image before him? What was the sort of stereotypical masculine expectation that he threw on its head?
Well, prior to James Dean, they actually did surveys at the time of what people thought was the ideal man. Mm-hmm. And at that time, in the early surveys, people were answering that the ideal man was in his 50s. He was gruff. He was well-established, and probably slightly overweight. He is, the big burly masculine type that the author John Dos Passos summed up as basically Ernest Hemingway, and wow. By way, yes, well, exactly. That's what they thought at the time. That Ernest Hemingway was kind of the ideal man, and as we all know, he had his own problems. But when James Dean comes along, he throws all of this over on its head by being young and handsome and possessed of those qualities of youth that are very different from a mature man who's 3 or 4 decades removed from that. And so what you see is within 1 or 2 years of James Dean coming on the scene, these surveys of who's your ideal man suddenly change. And it's no longer actors who are in their 50s and 60s who are making hearts flutter. It's now much younger men who are in their 20s, people like Paul Newman, people like Steve McQueen, and especially James Dean, who topped almost all of those surveys in the 2 years following his death.
Wow. And here's a chicken or egg question for you. How much do you think that he shaped a change in what people found the ideal man or attractive? And how much do you think he just reflected a change that was already happening in society and he just happened to be the poster boy in the right place at the right time?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. If you go back to some of the documents that Warner Brothers, the studio that produced Dean's films, was collecting at the time, you can see that the Warner Brothers executives knew before they hired James Dean that the coming thing was going to be these younger, good-looking men, because that's what they predicted that the growing teenage market would be interested in. But because it was James Dean who broke through and became the poster boy for it, he shaped this trend in a way that probably wouldn't have happened if it had been, say, Paul Newman, because right. James Dean is much more eccentric in his personality. He's a wilder and to some extent weirder figure than a lot of the other actors who were his contemporaries. And so that it changes the trajectory of how people thought about masculinity and who the ideal man was in a sort of odd way by pushing it a little more toward the quirky, toward the individual, rather than the more conformist figures that it would have been had it been a different young blonde man.
Absolutely. And you say that you want to talk about his secret personality, the guy behind the image. How do you go about researching that? How do you get to, from this standpoint as well, in time, you obviously can't speak to him. How do you go about doing research for something like that?
Well, in the case of my book, it was particularly difficult because at this point, now so far removed from the 1950s, nearly all of the people who knew James Dean have passed on. And in fact, in the course of writing this book, the last 3 or 4 people who had been friends with him, they have passed on during the writing of it. So I wasn't able to speak to people directly, but there is a vast amount of literature about Dean, including lots of interviews and lots of documents that really show what was going on at the time. James Dean's one of the best documented people in history, and that's a shocking statement because his life was so short, but because of the intense interest in him after his death, the media collected enormous amounts of information about him in the decades that followed, more than for almost any other person of his time period. So there's a lot to draw from. But in the case of my book specifically, I was able to work with an archive of material that his agent, Jane Deasy, had kept secret for over 7 decades. And this material included James Dean's correspondence, his business records, and just everyday ephemera from his apartment keys to his telephone bills. And by having that record of the very granular day-to-day activity that he went through, I was able to put together a more thorough picture of his life than a lot of previous authors who were working more from anecdotes and stories and had fewer documents to draw from.
That's pretty extensive. So, right, let's go. The meat and the bones of your book is about this person that we're dying to hear about. What did you discover about him, and what can you tell us about him that you wouldn't get on a surface glance?
Well, one of the things that, to my immense surprise, is still relatively unknown is that James Dean was a queer man who had relationships with both men and women. Now, even though this has been in the public record for decades now, going all the way back to the 60s and 70s, it's still a new revelation for a lot of people because of his image and because of the way that he gets talked about. In my book, I take it beyond the stories that previous authors had published and really get down to the granular level of the documentation behind it. And I was able to uncover some new evidence showing the extent to which being a queer person in Hollywood affected James Dean and changed how he approached acting, how he approached his life, and the degree to which it really shaped the personality that you see on screen. In the most dramatic instance, I found record that the boyfriend that he had in the early 1950s came back just before James Dean was about to make his screen debut and attempted to sue him, trying to collect back money that he claimed to have spent on James Dean during their relationship. Now, this man, Rogers Brackett, he knew that that kind of publicity in the 1950s would be terrible for Dean and it would destroy his career before it even began. And so James Dean settled this out of court. He settled it, and there's a settlement agreement that's extant that shows the payments and what they agreed to in order to end the threat of exposure. He ended up paying Rogers Brackett $800, which doesn't sound like a lot of money now. It was a lot of money back then, but it really goes to show you that these documents were kept secret for 70 years because everyone involved, his agent, his estate, his family, were so afraid that if this came out, he would be known as a queer actor or something along those lines, and he wouldn't be popular anymore. So, when those documents finally came to light in 2023, and I was able to recognize what these were and make use of them in writing my book, it really opened a new chapter into what life was like for James Dean and how that reflected the morals and mores of Hollywood at the time, and also how it reflected the way people have thought about people in that situation for decades. It's to my mind ridiculous that for 70 years, everybody kept this hidden with the idea that, oh my God, what if somebody found out?
Yeah.
Like, he's been dead for 70 years. It shouldn't be that big of a deal now. And it is a big deal, though, because it's still the kind of thing that's very difficult for many people, especially those in the media, to talk about when it comes to historical figures that have that level of recognition and that level of being revered.
It's crazy to think that someone could actually blackmail him. That was essentially blackmail for just revealing who he was. Nothing. He wasn't doing anything sinister. It was just he's queer, but he's in Hollywood. How do you think this did affect him, having to keep that part of him secret? Did his managers know? How many people in the industry would have known and be like working with him to keep it a secret? Or did he have to keep it secret from pretty much everybody?
Well, that is a great question. And the answer to that is that a lot of those documents were purposely destroyed. There are many letters that seem to hint at things in other correspondence that is no longer in existence. And we know from the testimony of some of James Dean's friends who wrote in their books much later, a lot of material was destroyed after James Dean's death with the intention of trying to, quote unquote, protect him from untoward revelations. And we can say, though, from some of the letters, that it is very likely that his agent, Jane Deasy, and his agent in Hollywood, Dick Clayton, both knew about this. Deasy kept letters, for example, from male fans, which was a strange thing. There are no letters in her archive from female fans, but she kept one from a male fan who was writing rather gushingly toward Dean. And Dick Clayton wrote a letter in which he discussed how he would solve Dean's quote-unquote problem. He didn't say what it was, only that they had discussed it. He had discussed it with Dean's other agent behind closed doors and wouldn't commit it to writing, which we can correlate with a letter that Dean wrote at the same time in which he said that Clayton told him he immediately needed to start dating women and that he was going to start setting him up with women who were available for public dating. Wow. So when you put two and two together, you can sort of see where that's going and who knew. And we also know from references in old magazines, little hints here and there, that it was probably an open secret across Hollywood at the time. There are references in movie fan magazines saying, you know, it's kind of weird. We couldn't find any woman who said that James Dean was terribly interested in dating women. Like, okay, so what are you trying to say there? But no one committed to explicit writing anything that is provable. But, you know, there's a lot of hints that you can read into things. And in terms of how it affected James Dean, it obviously affected him greatly because he wrote many letters about how miserable and upset he was and how terrible some of the things that he had to do to maintain his image were. And to a great extent, when you hear the stories about how he was eccentric and weird and surly and not friendly, a lot of that derives from the fact that he was spending a great deal of time trying to act a part that he didn't always feel comfortable being.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to take your toll on you if you've got to hide this huge part of yourself and, you know, you're constantly under the public gaze. It'd put you in a pretty bad mood, wouldn't it? I think it's fair enough then if he was a bit grumpy here or there. Sort of wrapping it up, what do you reckon his take on Hollywood and their acceptance or not acceptance, I don't know, of queer people in the industry today? Have things changed? If he was the new poster boy in 2025, would he have a very different experience? How do you think he'd see things now?
Well, certainly it's very different today than it was back then. I can't really speak to how he would have seen it because, you know, when you think about how people lived in those days, for somebody like James Dean, it wasn't just that he was trying to hide part of himself, but it was also that you end up denying part of yourself. And he probably would never have called himself queer, regardless of how he acted, behaved, or felt, because he didn't feel that he was part of that community so long as he was acting the public role that he wanted to be seen as. So if he were alive today, his experience would be entirely different at almost every level. And I doubt he would be anywhere near the same person because the experience would have been so vastly different. That said, one of the more difficult things to think about in looking at how people lived back then versus today is that while formally, you know, we're a lot more accepting today than we were back then, it's not always all that different. And there are many places where it's hardly any different at all. And it is still very difficult to be queer or to be nonconforming in any particular way. And across the world right now, we're seeing a retrenchment of LGBTQ rights. We're seeing all sorts of legislation and government actions trying to clamp down on those rights and freedoms. So to the extent that we can say it's better today, yes, it is certainly better today. Is it completely different? Unfortunately, no, not yet.
Okay, that answer had a lot of depth, actually, and you went way further than I was expecting, so thank you for that. Book sounds absolutely fascinating. Who is it for? What would you like readers to take away from it?
The book is for anyone who is interested about the life of James Dean, the life of queer people in the 20th century, and just for anyone who's interested in the idea of a good mystery and how we develop the myths about our lives. What you should take away from the book is that people are pretty much the same across time and space, and when you have particular challenges in life, you can eventually overcome them, as James Dean did. He started out with all of those challenges derived from the person he was trying not to be and the person he was trying to make other people believe him to be. And in the end, he became the most famous person on the face of the earth. And one of the things to keep in mind is that this man, who for several years was the most famous actor and one of the most famous people anywhere, was himself a queer man. And that is an accomplishment that few others can have and hold.
Love it. That is a fantastic response. Thank you again. Thank you so much for your time. And I guess the other thing to take away from that is that he was hot. There's no denying it. All right. This was Jason Colavito. Have I said that right? Colavito, yes. Speaking to us about Jimmy, The Secret Life of James Dean. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay, goodbye. If you're interested in getting your hands on that book, you can find it on the Talk Radio Europe bookshop, or of course just pop it into Google and I'm sure you'll find other places where you can get your hands on it.